Well, good evening, folks. In our class tonight, I want you to do something. I want you to put yourselves tonight in the place of some other folks. Now, I know that's not a possibility, but we want to try to do that. We're going to go back to begin in the book of Exodus tonight, but really we're going to dwell on Numbers chapter 13. In the book of Exodus, now I'm going to try to paint the picture for you, and your job is to put yourself in the position of the people that we're talking about. In the book of Exodus, we read about the Hebrews or the Jews or the children of Israel, whatever you want to call them, because they're called by three different names. They're slaves in Egypt. Now, realize, and I know I can't do this, and I know you can't either, but let's try. These people have been slaves all of their lives. Their parents were slaves. Their grandparents were slaves. They'd been down in Egypt for 400 some years, and all they knew was slavery. Now, I've never been a slave, and my parents haven't been slaves, and none in my family have been, and I can't think of that, how they must feel. But they were slaves to the extent that they were told where to live, where to work, how to work, and they lived in poverty. Then comes Moses and says, I'm going to lead you out of Egypt to the promised land. Excuse me. They understood from much of what their traditions had been that they'd passed on from generation to generation. Remember, we know from the scriptures, from Acts chapter 7, that when Moses was born, his parents instilled in him the idea that there's a God and he would deliver them from Egypt and that he would be an important part of that delivery. So the children of Israel, without going through all of the details which you know, went through the 10 plagues. That must have been scary, to say the least. And then the night that they left Egypt, there was a lot of death in Egypt that night. And that must have been a frightening experience. Then they left and they got to the Red Sea, and they began to realize that their world was going to be different. And then to make matters worse, the Egyptian army is following them. And in their minds, now picture this, in their minds, what's going to happen when the army overtakes us? They're going to make us go back to Egypt. We're going to be slaves again, and probably Pharaoh, who had already made life difficult for us, remember, he took away the straw, and they found it very difficult to make brick. Now, what's he going to do now? Will some of us die? What will happen to Moses? Will he be killed? They're living under a great deal of apprehension, a great deal of fear. And then Moses says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. And he opened up the Red Sea and said, now go through it. Now, folks, I don't care who you are. It's not a common thing to have a river opened and you walk through on dry land. Now, I don't know how you would feel, but if Moses said, Vinton, you go first, I'd probably be walking through it looking like this and that, expecting any moment, you know what? It to close up on me. So they were apprehensive. And they got on the other side. And of course, the thought immediately is, well, here come the chariots. They're in the water too, or where the water's supposed to be. And then God closes up the Red Sea. And they've been saved from the Egyptian army. And there's rejoicing. And you can read the Song of Miriam, and there's rejoicing. We made it. And then they started through the desert or deserted area. And it's not a very pleasant scene. You can read it. We know the story. It's all through Exodus. They murmur and complain. There are no onions. There are no cucumbers. There's nothing they had back in Egypt. And they grumbled and they complained. We're all going to die out here. Then there was no water, no meat, no bread. And God finally gave them those things. They murmured and complained again that there's no variety in our diet. But you know, and without me reading it, that Moses kept issuing to them the promise that God made them. I'm going to lead you to the promised land. The promised land, of course, is the land of Canaan. And we're going to get there and we're going to enter the promised land, and it's going to be a land flowing with milk and honey. We still use that phrase today. Over in Morrow County, when the settlers moved into Morrow County, the land west of Mount Gilead was such a rich land. They named their township Canaan. That whole idea is that Canaan is a rich land. Now this brings us to the 13th chapter of the book of Numbers. As Moses leads the children of Israel up to the borderland of the land of Canaan, Moses does something that is recorded for us in the 13th chapter in detail. Now, it would take all night this evening for us to read all of it, but they chose one man from each of the 12 tribes to go in and spy out the land. Now, I want you to remember, none of these 12 men had ever been here. This is a foreign country. They need to check out the topography. They need to check out the richness of the land. And most importantly, they need to check out who's there. So the instructions are given. And I want to read the instructions if you have your Bibles. Numbers chapter 13. Verse 18. And see the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, in what cities they be that dwell in, whether they live in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether there be wood therein or not. And be ye of good courage, and bring the fruit of the land. Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. That's the instructions. We all understand from reading this many times, they made their trip from the northern part all the way down to the south, and they, as the Old Testament calls it, spied out the land. We would say they searched out the land. And they found it a land flowing with milk and honey. In other words, rich. There's a specific example. And I've tried this many times to picture it. They were in a certain river valley, which is described in the Old Testament. And they found a cluster of grapes. I've got grapes in my backyard. I don't raise very good grapes. My clusters don't get much bigger than this. But they found a cluster of grapes that was obviously very large and put it on a pole, and two men carried it. Now, if I had seen that cluster of grapes and was told that it was growing in your backyard, I'd want to see it. And they brought the other fruit of the land, and they brought it back to the people. And they gave a really glowing report of what they saw. This is a marvelous land. This is what God's promised us. It's wonderful. It's going to be great because of what's there. But then they said, we have a problem. The problem is very simply this. There are a lot of people that live there, and they list the Hittites and the Amalekites and the Canaanites and so forth. And they live in big cities, and they're well fortified. And then the sons of Anak live there, giants. And then they use a phrase. And I think we'll dwell on this phrase a little while, but the phrase they use is, compared to them, we're grasshoppers. In other words, we can't defeat them. In the writing of this account, which Moses is the author of it, there are a lot of details given here which we can't really talk about tonight. But when that was brought up to the people, 2 of the 12 spies said, oh yes, that's true. But just remember this, folks. God's on our side. And I like the way that Joshua put it in that 14th chapter that follows. He said, those people that inhabit the land of Canaan are just like bread for us. Which simply means we'll eat them up. And he gives the basis of that statement is God's on our side. Now, we sitting in this room tonight will think, oh yeah, surely they know that because God just delivered them from the Egyptian army, right? God's just been feeding them all this time. Miraculously. But they believe the report of the 10 spies. Then as chapter 14 opens up, it tells us that the people cried all night. Now don't let that sentence pass you by. They cried all night. Now remember what they've been through. You're putting yourselves in their shoes. They cried all night because they've been slaves. They've been made a promise. They've come to the edge of that promised land and they realize they don't have an army. They don't have the equipment militarily. They don't have the physical power to conquer the land that's been promised to them. What's their future? Think about it. What future do they have? And someone speaks up, and you can read the wording. Someone speaks up and says, let's go back to Egypt. The account says, someone said, let's choose a captain, that is another leader, and let him lead us back to Egypt. You know, there are very few accounts in history of people who were slaves and then found out later that life's difficult outside of slavery and want to go back. There are some accounts. But, ladies and gentlemen, here are people that have suffered through the plagues They've suffered through the Red Sea experience. They've suffered through the wandering in the wilderness. And now the promise is dashed in front of them. Let's go back. Joshua speaks up after this and makes an impassionate plea. We can do this. God's on our side. We can do it. In the middle of chapter 14, God speaks to Moses. And if this is not our theme tonight, but it would be a wonderful thing to talk about it. God speaks to Moses and in essence says, He's tired of these people. He's delivered them, He's fed them, He's watered them, He's protected them, and God is fed up with them. He's going to destroy them. This is a really very significant encounter here between God and Moses. Moses pleads with God. And quickly, let me give you Moses' argument, so to speak. He says, Lord, if you destroy these people, then the Egyptians, the Amalekites and the Perizzites and the Hittites and all the other ites are going to say that you weren't strong enough or powerful enough to save these people that you have brought up here. Now, Moses is rather, well, let's put it this way. He's very courageous to make such an argument before God. But God understands, obviously, and accepts Moses' argument and said, no, I'll not destroy them. But he says, here's what we'll do. You turn around tomorrow. That is, you turn the people around. Now remember, the number of people that left Egypt has been estimated anywhere from 1 to 1.5 million. You turn these people around tomorrow, and you head back into the wilderness. And everyone who is 20 years and older, let them die there. And then another generation will arise and will go into the promised land. Now, that's our theme tonight. And we've said all that just to get to there. The New Testament says several places that the children of Israel did not enter in because of unbelief. They didn't believe God could deliver the land to them. I want us to take for just a few more minutes and talk about the consequences of their unbelief. There are three things I want to bring your attention to. Number one, these people who witnessed the plagues, who witnessed the crossing through of the Red Sea, who witnessed all of the other things that are described in Exodus, never got to see what was promised them. They never got to see the flowing Jordan River. They never got to see the mountain on which Jerusalem was built. They never got to see the rich valleys, the hillsides that were just perfect for the raising of sheep and goats. They never got to see it. They undoubtedly talked about it. Can you imagine sitting around a campfire, a family there, a large family maybe? And God's promised us this land. And you know, I knew one of the spies, one of them might say. And he saw this rich land. It's a marvelous place. But we're not going to get to see it. Now you keep that thought in mind. Secondly, they understood something that must have been the most disheartening thing imaginable. They knew that the very God that closed the Red Sea on the Egyptian army said, you're going to wander in the wilderness until you're dead. You don't have any hope, folks, of seeing the promised land. And the writer of the Old Testament and the writers of the New Testament tell us they were condemned to wander in the wilderness all of those years because of their unbelief. They didn't believe God's promises. Now, what did it mean to wander? Let's say you're 20 years old, and maybe you live 30 more years. What does that mean? More desert? More desert? No more rivers flowing with crystal water that might have been theirs? All of the hardships, now think about this, all of the hardships that they had after they got through the Red Sea and wandered there for a short time, it's going to be their life for the rest of their human existence. Think about that. And number 3, they were going to miss all of the pleasures that the promised land would give them. You know, it's inconceivable to us that why in the world didn't these people believe God from what He's done and taken us up there and we could have enjoyed living there. I hear people all the time say, when someone asks them, do you enjoy where you're living? Oh, yeah, we got a wonderful place and we're enjoying it. And somebody moves and says, well, how do you like your new home in a different state? Oh, it's a lot better than where we were. We're enjoying it. These people never got to enjoy the promised land. Now, let's move all of our attention for a minute to Richland County, Ohio. This you can handle. God has made a promise. He's made a promise to all nations, to all individuals, to male, to female, to bond or free. Or as it's put in the book of Mark, every creature, every human being, God's made a promise. He said, Christ said rather, that when I go back to heaven, I'm going to prepare a place for you. I've had people say, Vinton, why don't you preach on heaven and tell us what it's like? You try that. Even the scriptures in describing heaven use earthly characteristics. Streets of gold. Well, folks, maybe gold doesn't have potholes in it. I don't know. But the point is, walking on gold doesn't really do a whole lot for me. The closest characteristics of heaven that I can comprehend is there's no sickness there. There's no sorrow there. There are no tears there. And there's no aging there. And there's no death. Now that I can handle a little bit. But Jesus said, I've gone to heaven to prepare a place for you. And where I am, I'm going to bring you there someday. Heaven is a promise to all mankind. This world isn't heaven. The prince of this world isn't Christ, folks. It's the evil one. So just like the children of Israel, God has made our world a promise that there's a heaven being prepared for you, unlike this world. Secondly, we understand that in our world here, there are many who do not believe that promise. Right? Some of them hope that that's true, but they don't believe in Him who made the promise. Who made the promise about the land of Canaan? God. Who made the promise about heaven? Christ, the Son of God. They don't believe. And if one does not believe, then he doesn't have any hope. John 3:18. So just think of all of the people in this world that we live in who do not accept, who refuse to accept, who choose to ignore, and who do not believe in the promise of God. They're going to have to live here on this earth the rest of their life and deal with all the sickness, the sorrow, and the death, and the so forth without hope. Remember what the writer said in the New Testament? If we have no hope, we are of all men most miserable. You know, most people I know really have a lot of hope. You know, we've had a bad year, someone might say, in our gardening. We didn't get much out of our garden. But next year it'll be a better year. That's called hope. Or I don't feel good at all right now, but I'm hoping tomorrow I'll be better. Okay, that's hope. But those that have no belief in Jesus, you know, if we don't believe in Jesus, we don't believe in God the Father. They go together. And on this life, they're miserable. And the thing also, and most importantly of all, these are the kind of folks that will never enjoy heaven. Now, let's turn over to the book of Hebrews. The Bible never tells us who wrote the book of Hebrews. A lot of people believe it's Paul. But whether it was or not, it is a letter or book written to Jewish Christians. That's why it's called Hebrews. And there's a lot of discussion about the Hebrew people in the book of Hebrews. And we learn a lot about God's dealing with the children of Israel by reading the book of Hebrews. And there's a whole lot of information here. But I want to turn over to the 3rd chapter. As you turn to the 3rd chapter, I want to read the first verse of the 2nd chapter, which is an introduction to what we're going to be reading. The writer wrote, "Therefore we Jewish Christians, ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we've heard, lest at any time we should let them slip." Peggy turned TV on a moment this afternoon, and there was a man on the Weather Channel that says one of the greatest dangers facing people in the deep south is that when a year goes by and there's no hurricane, they forget to be ready the following year. We all know what that means, right? In other words, it didn't happen this year, so, oh well, forget about it. It's not going to happen. So the writer of the book of Hebrews said, you've heard the gospel message. You've heard the promises. We shouldn't let them slip. Now move over to the 3rd chapter. And I'm not trying to avoid the stuff in between, but I want to look at verse 12 of the 3rd chapter. And I want to read it with you. Take heed, or take warning, as one translation says. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief, Now the brethren there are his Jewish Christians, if Paul be the writer, his fellow Jewish Christians. He said, I want to warn you that there is a danger of having a heart of unbelief. In other words, you become a Christian and then you lose your faith in departing from the living God. So I want to warn you. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you through the hardness, through the deceitfulness of sin. Hey, there's a sermon right there in that verse. How often are we to encourage anybody? Every day. Daily. Well, it is called today because, there might not be a tomorrow. Lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. There's a parable that Jesus told. All of us know it, the parable of the sower. Sowed seed on 4 different soils. And explaining it, Jesus says that sin brought deceitfulness into the heart of some of those folks. But let's read on. Verse 14, for we were made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. In other words, keep on keeping on. You became a Christian. That was your confidence in the beginning. Now keep on. Verse 15, while it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the day of provocation. Now, verse 16, for some, when they had heard, did provoke. What are we talking about here? Well, let's read it. We'll find out. Howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. So Moses here is referred to by the writer and the events that we've just talked about. Some of those people provoked God because of their unbelief. Verse 17. But with whom he, that is God, was grieved 40 years. Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believe not? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. The whole message tonight is summed up in that last phrase. As Christians, particularly, we need to keep our faith strong until we're over with on this earth. Because there were those that left Egypt whose faith wavered when they got to the promised land. And because of it, they wandered in the wilderness where they died. The whole idea on Sunday night here has been the Old Testament was written that we might learn from it. And so here the writer of the book of Hebrews is telling us the same thing. We need to learn from their mistakes. Well, I appreciate your attention tonight. Anybody comment or question about our lesson? Joe, what's the hymn number?
718.
718. Joe will pick out a couple of verses. And if you'll turn to 718, and of course the Lord's invitation to become a Christian is always open, and if you need to do that while we stand and sing, do so.